and welcome to Brain Bites with Dr. B. I'm Jess Beachkofsky, your friendly online psychiatrist. Today we're talking about food addiction. Let's dig in. So, what's food addiction? Is that a thing? Well, there's a lot of controversy right now about what this is because there's no single molecule, there's no chemical, there's no specific compound that we're attacking to call the actual addiction. So there's no specific target that we're looking at right now. Currently, it's more conceived as a behavioral condition, but I've been reading some really interesting literature that has some really compelling information about food addiction, specifically to ultra high processed foods. So we do have eating disorders, of course, too, and there might be some overlap with food addiction, but in some cases it looks like these are two separate things. So just because people are exposed to these ultra high processed foods, not everyone's going to get addicted, just like with any other substance. Just because you're exposed to something doesn't automatically trigger an addiction. But it looks like, based on the statistics, there are about 14% of adults and 12% of children that have an addictive like eating phenotype. That's pretty impressive. All addictions will cause an increase in dopamine in the striatum. So it doesn't matter what the addictive substance is, or if it's a gambling addiction or some other kind of addiction. This is something that we see in brain imaging with people that have an addiction. And we see it also with these ultra high processed foods. So there is some brain's imaging evidence that says, yeah, we're seeing this increase of dopamine in the striatum. We've got an addiction on our hands. And another little compelling piece, the opioid antagonist medications, the ones that we use to treat a lot of addictions, they seem to help quite a bit with the symptoms of food addiction too. So let's talk a little bit about assumptions about obesity. So just to be clear, I was raised in a fat phobic home, and it was not a good environment from that standpoint. A lot of people hold these ideas that fat people have no self-control, that making bad food choices is just laziness, or that if we were good, healthy adults, we could make better choices. But can we? What about our children? What about kids? Can they? So this is interesting to me. So what are these ultra high processed foods, and why are we even thinking that you could have an addiction to them? This is just, I love this. This is what I love about reading research. Sometimes it's just so interesting to me. So these are not natural foods. We know that. We know that not everything we eat is natural. But these specific substances, these are novel substances that are not found in nature. They take a combination of high sugar plus high fat. There are additives that are put in for increasing the amount of flavor in the food. And then there are sensory enhancers. So something that makes the mouth feel really nice, the texture of something, like that shelf stable cookie dough stuff. Like that texture doesn't just exist if you leave it on the shelf normally. Like that's not normal. So they have these additives that improve your sensory experience of the food. It smells a certain way, it feels a certain way, might even look a certain way. And these substances do not have the fiber and water that many foods do. So, what this is an ultra high processed food. And it gives your brain a quick hit of calories, and it really strengthens that reward process. So instead of having things like fiber and water and other, nutrients to slow stuff down, even protein to slow anything down, we're talking like quick, straight to the brain. You feel good, it tastes good. That was fantastic. Let's have some more of that. And just to be clear, I understand natural isn't always good either. I mean, snake venom is natural. It doesn't mean that it's not going to hurt you. Natural doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for you. But the idea that our brains are wired to take in sustenance, and that it usually is encouraged to take a little of this and a little of that to try to cover all the bases. We want all the nutrients that we need to be strong and healthy. You're brain is wired to want certain things. And, I want some of this and I want some of this. These foods weren't found in nature with all this stuff in them. So you might have a food that is high in sugar, like a fruit, but there's generally not fat in fruit or not very much. But then you have nuts, and nuts are very high in fat, and they generally don't have any sugar. So you could put those together, but then they also have the fiber and the water and the protein and some of the other things that slow digestion down. So you're getting the benefit of the enjoyable bits of the food, the sugar and the fats and the mouthfeel, but you're also not getting that super quick hit because your body has to digest it. It still has fiber, it still has to be broken down, unlike some of these prepackaged ultra high processed foods. So just a little clarification there. So I'm going to relate some of this to the tobacco industry because some of the case that they're making for the addiction criteria is based on some of the Surgeon General's stuff that came out in the 80s about why the nicotine and tobacco products are bad for you. So they used 4 criteria, and these can be applied to food addiction. So those criteria are compulsive use, just feeling use and use and use, mood altering effects in the brain. So, yeah, I like it. It tastes good. I feel better. Reinforcing behavior. So, we already know that you have it, it's good, you want more. And the triggering of urges or cravings. So, when you don't have it, you want it. These criteria were used for tobacco and they apply to food addiction as well. So, if these highly processed foods are addictive and not just unhealthy, then intake isn't just a matter of choice because there's another process going on, and some people are compelled to have this intake even though they may not want to have it, they may not naturally choose it. But this is a big industry and it's a big public health problem. Stress eating affects about a third of the population, including me. And most of that is of ultra high processed foods. They have done studies where those that are diagnosed with binge eating disorder, 100% of their binges are of high processed foods. And about 60% of the calories consumed in the United States are of high processed foods. It's kind of scary. So it's also important to note that this doesn't just affect adults like a typical drug addiction. So oftentimes what we see is in teenage years, the teens are exposed to alcohol, to drugs, other addictive compounds, and that's when they start engaging in some of the potentially addictive behavior. When we're talking about these ultra high processed foods, like this spans the entire lifespan. So from in utero all the way until late adult age. Exposure begins in utero. So when mom eats those ultra high processed foods, she's exposing the fetus, and that developing brain can get kind of turned on to the idea of these highly processed foods and the quick hits that it gives. There have been some studies that were done, and when these kids are in their early years, they tend to be more likely to be overweight or obese by medical criteria earlier on. So they're already predisposed to have brains that want these high fat, high sugar, highly processed foods. These things are heavily marketed to kids. So, most kids don't get exposed to cocaine, but most kids are exposed to highly processed foods. They're even served in the lunchroom at public schools. Like they're available everywhere, even in food deserts, which is another concern for public health because people who don't have access to healthier choices, they do have access to this. So, impacting people across the lifespan and pretty much just about anywhere, at least in the United States. So in some cases, the problems with eating these foods, these food addictions, they can lead to obesity. And in other cases, it just leads to feeling bad and having these negative emotions, the withdrawal effects, the cravings, and your reward system just being all messed up around food. So it is very likely that you have some clients that are impacted by food addiction. And there is a scale out there you can download and use if you're not using it already. It is the Yale Food Addiction Scale. And then they have a modified one that's even shorter. And it uses the criteria for substance use disorders from DSM 5, but applied in a food way. So that scale is available if you want to use that with your clients. But I think really anyone can benefit from a better understanding of these substances, why it's so easy to eat and so hard to stop, because they're engineered that way. So I don't know about you, but I don't like the idea of being manipulated. I don't like being on social media where the algorithm is stealing all my free time. I don't like being sold to by all those things that are specifically marketed to me from AI and all the data on my habits. I don't like that. If these foods had a warning label, would it dissuade me at least some of the time? I don't know. Knowing myself, probably yes, probably a little bit. And I don't think they're going to get a warning anytime soon. It's an awfully big industry to say, like, stick this on there. For those who have been around since like the tobacco warnings and stuff came out, that was a whole thing. So we may be looking at something similar going on with the food industry. Anyway, I already know how bad I can feel after giving in to eating some of these ultra high processed foods. I tend to overeat them until I feel terrible. I don't end up feeling satisfied anyway. It doesn't meet the actual emotional needs that I'm trying to get met. And it can take days for me to just recover from that and stop craving those things. This is very reinforcing for me. And so, thinking about it in terms of being manipulated by a big company to buy some kind of like chemical garbage that they made up specifically just to get me to buy it doesn't sit well with me. Anyway, I find this all fascinating. I think this is very interesting food for thought. I hope your brain is full of yummy psych goodness. No calories required. Grab more tasty tidbits at brainbiteswithdrb.com. Enjoy.